When you have seen zombies feed on the flesh of a living man, seen fear in the dark, shark eyes of a vampire, being baptized in the devil's blood, then you may speak to me of righteousness. But for now, I am the thread by which your life hangs, the only wall between you and ungodly horror. I am the bloody top of the food chain.
I've been a broken record in the past when it comes to the topic of numerical scores in video game reviews, as in that I generally don't like them. Like, I get it, this desire to quantify something that's actually extremely subjective, like where would we be if you can't put clear labels on things and put them in neat boxes? Especially since we're living in a consumer society and most video game journalistic outlets consider themselves a quote-unquote guide for the informed consumer. Cool. It's just so much more pithy to make a statement like, this game is a stinking 6 out of 10 than to differentiate in lavish detail to reach the specific niche audiences for whom a game is predestined to become the next hyperfixation, way more than any 9 out of 10 blockbuster could. Is Pathologic Classic HD a better game than, I don't know, God of War Ragnarok? If you ask me, I'd say 1,000 times yes, but there's a ton of people who would say that God of War is objectively a better game. Like, I get what you mean, and average consensus will probably prove you statistically right, but it's still bullshit.
It's just a matter of how you look at it, that's all. So don't worry, okay?
The game I'm covering in this video, Nocturne by Terminal Reality, is the perfect example of a title that I missed out on when it was released because of extremely erratic review scores. In 1999, which was the high time of me obsessively reading PC game magazines to get all my news, updates, and reviews about PC gaming, I have been extremely compelled by Nocturne's stark and evocative gothic horror visuals and aesthetic from the previews leading up to its release, but a whopping 30% rating from my English PC gaming magazine of choice at the time, with a loud warning of terribly unpolished game design and jank, was at the time more than enough to convince me to give it a wide berth. The thing is, having played it years later, I absolutely get it, and I even agree with all the criticism it received in that repellent review. And still, I think the stamp that it received is bullshit.
Yes, it is.
Because boy, this is one of the most fascinating, intriguing, and just outright coolest shit horror classics I've had the joy of rediscovering in my long years as a YouTube horror game sommelier. See, that's a thing with art that's trying to be cool. It usually tries to imitate what's contemporarily considered cool, and that usually has the tendency to age like fine milk. Which is why I was surprised going into Nocturne how well it actually held up. Like, it is edgy and grimdark and campy and corny, but in a delightful, self-aware kind of camp way that feels like it gets almost better with age. And hey, to be fair, many of the other reviewers at the time, and later on, see the matter quite differently. There were quite a few outlets who gave this game high 80 and maybe even 90 and beyond scores, heaping it with praise as a near-perfect horror gaming jewel with only minor little flaws that you ostensibly barely even notice. Thing here is, I think these reviews are just as wrong as that devastating one that claims there's virtually nothing redeemable about it. Nocturne is an incredibly flawed game that's at times as polished as sandpaper, as badly balanced as me when I had crystals floating through my inner ears last year, and so janky it'd make the perfect prayer idol in Slavic game dev churches. But equally, Nocturne is also an utterly impressive, fascinating game, not just in the context of its time. It tries a lot, and in that succeeds just as often as it fails, which is something I've always had a big fascination, like a big soft spot for in art. Because what matters is that Nocturne is truly a game without peer, in many ways. Built on an engine that would turn even cutting-edge PCs of the time into regular furnaces, it delivered visuals that still managed to make my jaw drop a whole 24 years after it came out. It is the epitome of a game that's impossible to boil down to a 2-digit number intended to quantify how quote-unquote objectively good it is. It's a horror gaming gem in the truest sense of the metaphor. Incredibly overlooked, totally neglected, and dropped from distribution into obscure abandonware state that, no matter how you end up feeling about it, will leave an impression on you. And one that I keep being bummed about that it never received a proper sequel, even though it did end up with a quite convoluted, strange, and unexpectedly enjoyable legacy. Or did you know that Nocturne, including all its vividly drawn-out characters and lore, is officially part of the Blair Witch canon? And it didn't even know that it would be at the time it was made? Oh, and right, that it also was the kernel from which the Blood Rain series originated? There's so much to uncover, and we're going to talk about all of this and more in this video. Gotta be honest, I've been excited to cover this game on my channel for ages by now. So let's quit the jibber-jabber and put on our sunglasses and dim the lights to immerse ourselves in the 1930s twilight zone of terminal reality's 1999 episodic survival horror pulp thriller Nocturne. A world in which a diaspora of terrifying nightmare creatures from our collective unconscious lives among the human population of the world and terrorizes us from the shadows. And in which a motley crew of secret agents works all across the globe to protect us from them. From the shadows. So, before we go on, I want to do a little thematically not unrelated throw-in here to introduce this video's sponsor. As I said, Nocturne, as well as many games I cover on this channel, is abandonware. There is no active distribution anywhere at the moment, so it's legally in a gray zone limbo where it is effectively not a crime to download a copy of it. Heck, technically the download of a game, no matter if abandonware or not, is not a crime to begin with. It's the distribution that's more troublesome. Anyway, digressing. You can find games like these on abandonware sites or on places like archive.org that work hard for the preservation of video game and software history, among many other things. A majority of these archive entries are offered via torrent peer-to-peer sharing. So even if it's technically decriminalized to download it, would I want my ISP and the governments and all kinds of data collection agencies to know about it? Freaking hell no. Plus, peer-to-peer networks automatically have you share your data, which is what you gotta be extra careful with. So yeah, I'd still never even consider getting even just abandonware titles without obfuscating my internet activity with a good VPN tunnel.
This is beginning to sound like a research assignment.
It's far more important than that.
Anything to make the job of data-clutching governments, ISPs, and data scalpers as hard as humanly possible. I've been using VPNs for ages by now, and for a bit more than a year now I've been using NordVPN and been perfectly happy with it. The application runs smoothly, fast and convenient, offers access to over 5,000 servers in 60 countries, and really nice features like double VPN to encrypt your data through 2 tunnels, customizable kill switch behavior, so you can, for instance, make NordVPN automatically close apps you never want to use without protection the moment you disconnect your VPN, if you forget to close them first. Nord servers run on RAM only and are regularly independently audited for their no-log policy, which is my #1 requirement for a VPN service. As I said, it's been working great for me, and if you want to give it a shot yourself, you can get a special offer under nordvpn.com/Ragnar, simple and easy, and get a 2-year plus 4-month subscription for a really sizable discount. You have a 30-day money-back guarantee, so it's risk-free if you don't end up liking it. Check it out if you're interested and get your exclusive discount at nordvpn.com/Ragnar. That said, thanks a lot for the sponsorship to Nord, and now let's get back to enjoying forgotten, edgy, campy pulp horror games. It is the beginning of the Great Depression. That is true for all of our collective mental state, as well as the historical time period Nocturne is set in. Back in the late 1920s, early 1930s, shadows were darker, coats were longer, and sunglasses worked best at night. It was also a time in which all kinds of occult creatures from our collective myths and folklore were running rampant across the globe. Vampires? Totally real. Werewolves? Absolutely. Ghosts, succubi, witches, demons and dark magics, voodoo, zombies, Frankensteinish, reanimated uber beings. You bet all the horror folktales, tropes and legends you can think of are very real indeed. And they, according to the US government, cause a clear and present danger to the safety and unwitting innocent human population. Which is why none other than Theodore Teddy Roosevelt, 26th President of the United States and founder of the precursor of what would later become the FBI, was well aware of all the supernatural goings-on and also founded the secret government organization Spookhouse, a globally operating task force to observe, study, survey, and most importantly, eradicate the superhuman threat. They call it Horrorcide. like genocide, only for horrors. Yeah, you guessed it. In Nocturne, we're wading knee-deep into morally questionable territory, because that's what governments do, don't they? And there couldn't be a more perfectly fitting protagonist to take control of for this setting than the Stranger, Spookhouse's top agent, whose name and past is a complete mystery to everyone involved.
Stranger, thank you for coming in on such short notice.
Always dressed in his physically simulated trench coat, fedora, and sunglasses. A stoic man of few words, the majority of which will be deeply cynical, because if there's one aspect about his personality he does liberally share with everyone, is that he hates monsters.
I don't like anyone. I hate monsters.
For which he's always packing his dual automatic pistols. Yeah, the 90s were just a time for guns akimbo. It's just logic. 2 guns are better than 1, especially with tactical laser pointers. If you haven't picked up on it by now, Nocturne is campy as fuck, and the Stranger is the perfect anti-hero avatar for the formula. It's a grimdark setting that manages to not feel insufferable because it has the right amount of self-awareness, while never succumbing to the farcical.
The Stranger, huh? You aren't hiding something that we should know, are you, soldier?
Nothing that need concern you.
Huh.
The best comparison I keep coming back to is the feeling of Chris Carter shows like X-Files and Millennium. Tonally and stylistically, it's closer to the latter, as well as some of the more gruesome X-Files episode, but the level of camp and self-aware bits of humor has a similar range as both of these shows as well, sometimes being quite serious and sometimes peppering in the right amount of goofiness that made some of the most memorable episodes so iconic and unforgettable. Jose Chang says hi. And the comparison is not willy-nilly. X-Files and Millennium were at the zenith of their popularity when Nocturne came out. Virtually in every interview with the developers, the X-Files were brought up as a point of comparison, and the whole episodic structure takes many pointers from the adventures of Mulder, Scully, and Frank Black. The clandestine government organization hidden away in a basement where the Stranger gets briefed for his assignments in a darkened room with a slide projector. It doesn't get more...
Ever hear of something called the Jersey Devil?
...than that.
Yeah.
Speaking of episodic, the late 90s and 2000s saw a number of video games try to go for an episodic format. It didn't stick around because, quite frankly, in most cases, it really didn't work as well as it sounded on paper, with very few notable exceptions. In my opinion, Nocturne is one of those, because the fact that across the game we get sent on 4 different assignments in the role of the Stranger, ranging from vampire and werewolf-rained Bavarian forests to a zombie-infected mining town in the heart of Texas, to the streets of mob-ruled Chicago in the early days of Prohibition, all the way to the heart of an ancient castle in France. This approach makes the game feel like there's always something new awaiting the players. The structure of missions starting in the Spookhouse headquarters with an active briefing and the freedom to talk to all the other members of the organization going about their own business, it feels really cool and satisfying and establishes the impression that this setting is way grander than what we get to see in this game alone. I always love when a game, without info dumping on you, gives you the feeling that what you get to witness is only a glimpse of what its narrative universe has in store for you. Nocturne really embraces the full power of the Monster of the Week format that made the X-Files so timelessly watchable and so incredibly fitting to the horror setting. And the first mission even has you team up with a red-headed female partner agent, although in Nocturne's case, the chemistry is not remotely as cute and amicable as Mulder and Scully. In fact, the Stranger and the half-vampire Svetlana Lupescu hate each other's guts, but are professional enough to put their feud to rest for the sake of the mission.
Nice to see you again, Stranger. I look forward to working with you.
As I said, I really love this episodic format for a survival horror game where it harmonizes with the story and setting, as it organically offers the player a diverse range of locations and scenarios across the length of the game, preventing the locations from getting repetitive too fast. I mean, we fight and puzzle our way through an eerie vampire castle, dark Bavarian forests, ancient tombs, and 1920s Chicago streets, as well as a western town, an abandoned mine shaft, and on top of that, Nocturne continues the tradition of 90s action games featuring moving train levels. Thinking of which, the first one in a 3D action game was, as far as I remember, Blood, whose protagonist always felt to me like what you'd get if you buried the Stranger from Nocturne and he'd come back as an undead Avenger. Horror shower thoughts. But since I mentioned that Nocturne is a survival horror game, it's actually a quite interesting outlier of the genre. This episodic level format already insinuates that it might be structured quite differently from most other survival horror titles, where it's not uncommon to be able to backtrack to the very beginning areas until late in the game. Unsurprisingly, when approaching its release, Nocturne was regularly compared to Resident Evil, to which the developers often replied that, hey, you only have to play it for a couple of minutes until you find that it's definitely not a knockoff. And it gets pretty quickly apparent that this is very much the case. Nocturne feels, in many ways, far more like an early, linear, story-focused first-person shooter, like Soldier of Fortune, for instance, both in structure as well as in overall game design and narrative flow, only that it controls like a fixed camera survival horror game and also has more exploration and puzzling peppered in. Where in your standard survival horror game, limited inventory space and resources and limited saving are a central part of the equation, in Nocturne, your inventory works far more like an FPS arsenal. You can pick up any weapon, select them via the number keys, and ammunition just gets added to the weapon's ammo count. No inventory management at all, and you can save and quick save at any time you like. And while there are certain parts where ammo can get a little tight, I've never found it to be something you have to constantly keep an eye on. The combat focuses way more on action. It's quite comparable to how you usually feel towards the end of a Resident Evil game, where you're battle-hardened and have collected a regular arsenal, which makes complete sense for the game's protagonist. The stranger has an immense reputation for getting shit done when it comes to monster and demon infestations. He's lots of experience, and he's being armed and equipped by an extremely well-funded government organization. Most of the times it feels like you're the exterminator that the monsters are scared of, not the other way around. Which doesn't mean that the game isn't tough as nails at times. Nocturne rarely shies away from putting you through nail-bitingly tough encounters, with many of the adversaries attacking and stalking you with quite different combat tactics all across the board. I find it genuinely fun to shoot my way through, most of the time, and quite frequently the game puts you in situations in which you feel like the badass hitman who's been sent to wipe the floor with anything the demon realm can throw at you, without ever even moving a facial muscle. It's also very similar when it comes to how the game plays, because at first glance, it feels like grade A survival horror with its fixed camera angles and tank-controlled character, just like the Resident Evils and Alone in the Dark says. But there's a few twists to the usual formula, which also add to the game feeling like its very own thing pretty quickly. Nocturne offers an optional mouse control scheme that makes you steer the stranger's rotation and upward-downward aim smoothly and seamlessly. I've heard many people say that this massively improves the game's handling in comparison to its genre contemporaries, making it feel almost like a first-person shooter, but with external camera perspectives, which would be technically a third-person shooter, but you know what I mean. That might very well be the case, that this controls better, although I must admit that I personally tried the keyboard mouse control scheme several times and it just doesn't seem to click with me. But hey, aside from that, you have the option to manually aim the stranger's weapons, either with the mouse or with the keyboard, which is helped by two very clearly traceable laser pointers for his dual pistols. Or, in the case of other weapons like the shotgun, your aim is projected with a transparent green cone, like here, indicating the weapon spread. Manual aiming gives you the one advantage of being able to, theoretically, aim for your opponent's body parts directly, which can optimize your damage output, as hitting the head for most creatures or center mass when you shoot wooden stakes with a crossbow at a vampire dramatically increases the damage. If it wouldn't be for the manual aim being really, really difficult. I'm talking Trespasser Jurassic Park levels of unnecessary difficulty in the way that it's simply so cumbersome and unintuitive to control that it becomes a frustrating chore rather than an engaging moment-to-moment gameplay loop. Luckily, the default way to aim is a pretty fun and cool-looking automatic target system, in which the stranger, out of his own volition, points his pistols at enemies as soon as they enter his effective range. It feels really engaging most of the time, and also sometimes a bit janky quirky, because he aims with each arm independently. So if there's an enemy in range of one arm and not the other, he'll only point, and shoot, the one gun. And if there are two enemies approaching you from different angles, he even splits his attention across two targets. Especially when the game came out, this was an incredibly jaw-dropping feature that made the game feel like a Hammer horror movie directed by John Woo or something like that. But don't let me create the impression that Nocturne is nothing but a constant shooting gallery. While you do sometimes stack up quite the pile of corpses on the way through the stages, especially compared to survival horror contemporaries, Nocturne also puts heavy emphasis on exploration and adventure game typical puzzle solving. That varies from chapter to chapter and from scene to scene, with some parts being almost devoid of lateral thinking challenges and other parts feeling like the occasional enemy you encounter is just there to break up the puzzle monotony. Nocturne really tries to shake it up as much as possible across the length of its playtime, and while most puzzles are not exactly the reinvention of the wheel, the variety helps to rarely make this an issue. Segments like the mining town, where you make the chapel your base of operations and then keep swarming out to scout the zombie-infested town for survivors and then escort them back to the safety of the chapel, or the Chicago segment, where you have to evade patrolling mobsters driving through the streets in gangster cars and use the back alleys and canals below to avoid confrontation as much as possible, to the chalet in the final chapter in which you're basically a lab rat in the maze of a horologist gone bad. Stuff just keeps being interesting and fresh with a very regular rhythm. But getting back to the guns here, if you have a knack for the technical, then you might have noticed that the system for the pistol aim, independent of character movement and rotation at work here, is inverse kinematics. These days, in video game development, it's relatively common, for instance, to make 3D characters walk stairs and always have their legs and feet in the right position automatically, calculated procedurally. But back in 1999, this was completely unheard of in video games. In fact, Nocturne is the first game that used this technology in a real-time game environment. Not just for the guns, but also for things like characters grabbing objects no matter how high they are, independently from the body's animation state, and a lot of other stuff. And yeah, you might also have noticed, or heard me gush already about, that the game looks absolutely phenomenal from a technical standpoint for a game that came out in 1999. If you compare it to, let's say, Unreal Tournament, which came out in the same year and is regarded as one of the technically most advanced and best-looking games of the time, while it does look great, and did look at the time, you notice that, for instance, shadows in this game cast additive, meaning they're plotted on the ground or the walls to add an extra overlay of darker color to the environments. And also that shadows are not dynamically cast on characters and other moving objects. Nocturne, however, once again was the very first game to feature a lighting engine where shadows are subtractive, meaning that every surface, no matter if it's players, enemies, or backgrounds, are exclusively lit by in-game light sources, and shadows are cast completely dynamically. This had never been done before in a video game as well, and the engine was capable of creating some astounding light and shadow simulations and make characters feel unprecedentedly grounded in their environments. A light source hitting a player model, casting a shadow that's accurately plotted on an enemy model, that then again accurately plots the combined shadow at the wall, where it combines with environment shadows naturally and doesn't overlap. In 1999, that shit was considered absolute black magic.
Black magic.
Quite fitting to the game's setting. This level of technical finesse also shines through for the cloth physics, for instance. Aside from the stranger's trench coat, there are several objects in the game that are simulated with real-time cloth physics that had, once again, never been done before in any video game to date like that. And luckily, this opulent technical presentation turned out to be not just plain flexing for flexing's sake, but the developers managed to regularly create really impressive, uncanny and eerie situations that could live and breathe through the technical framework. As the game's production lead Jeff Mills said in an interview with IGN, when they realized the technical and aesthetic capabilities of their lighting engine, it was clear that the first game they were going to make with it had to be a horror game because of how much potential for highly cinematic, positively terrifying and moody scenes and ambiances the engine gave them. And hey, while Duke Nukem already featured bloody footprints after you stepped in a puddle of your enemy's blood, I always appreciate this feature in games. It always manages to effortlessly create such messy murder scenes after the ultra-violence is over. Pure carnage art. I hope I could convince you that Nocturne is a surprisingly excellent horror game for the fact that it's so overlooked and neglected these days. The setting is pulpy, chaotic, and fun in a way that an X-Files makes me rewatch its entire run for the 8th time at the moment, and I have no doubt that if the setting would be picked up and blessed with a reboot or sequel today, it would absolutely hold up. The cast of characters is surprisingly big and well written, realized, and the banter between them, while sometimes a bit cringe, sure, has lots of moments that make me genuinely vibe with the characters. Like the stranger whose stoic, impenetrable demeanor often creates hilariously awkward situations and conversations, especially for him.
This is ridiculous.
Everyone has to say the password, stranger. Even you.
An intruder would be dead by now.
Rules, stranger. You think I enjoy sitting in this little box all day?
Your enjoyment does not concern me.
The password, stranger.
By this point, I could have killed you and flipped the switch to open the door myself.
You wouldn't do that. Would you?
The world is a dark place.
Who will protect the world from darkness?
We will, after we play our stupid games.
Have a nice day.
What's left of it.
Ever since I picked it up for the first time, I've been coming back to replay it again and again, or sometimes I'll just pick up an episode that just feels right now, on the regular, because it's just such a one-of-a-kind game. There's nothing quite like it. But that does not mean that it's a near-flawless game, like some tests back in the day tried to insinuate. Oh boy, no. If you've watched my videos for a bit, you know that I usually omit focusing too much on the negative and try to point out what's great and redeemable about the classics I dig up. But with Nocturne, I would feel intellectually dishonest if I would omit the flaws. There is simply no other way but to learn to stop worrying and love the Jank. Pretty much every review I read of the game at the time emphasized how difficult Nocturne is. And I do agree, in part. The only caveat with this is that it feels to me like the parts that are meant to be difficult are often an absolute cakewalk, while parts that are supposed to be completely trivial, not even meant to be a challenge to begin with, turn out to be so ludicrously hard that they're only beatable by excessive save scumming or cheesing the game. Luckily, the game does offer a generous save anywhere, anytime feature, including quick saves, because otherwise Nocturne would be a true nightmare, and not the one that it's meant to be by design. Nocturne quite frequently is janky, glitchy, and horrendously balanced. Almost exclusively when you encounter parts in which enemies overpower you, the thing that makes it difficult is not that it's a well-thought-out challenge of how to smartly solve the actual encounter at hand, but the fact that the controls are often so clunky and slow that it's virtually impossible to deal with them in the way the game wants the players to feel when doing it. While many other times the game unleashes waves of enemies on the player that pose virtually no threat because of how easily you can mow them down without having to worry about ammo at all. And you can tell that those are parts that were not meant to be trivial. But this gets way worse with the inclusion of jumping/platforming puzzles. Remember my Alone in the Dark video where I said that the brilliant original game of the series' one major flaw was the inclusion of tank-controlled 3D platforming segments under time pressure? Welcome to Nocturne, which somehow managed to make this even worse than the at the time already 7-year-old originator of the genre. The game is peppered with constant instances of more and more jumping puzzles and with controls that make it incredibly hard to steer the player character with enough precision and intent to overcome them because it's so wishy-washy when precision and intent is what these jumping segments are designed around. And not even just during the jumping segments, but there are so many areas in the game where we have height differences within one of the static backgrounds that are, because of the background's quite uniform darkness everywhere, incredibly badly readable, that it keeps regularly happening that you'll fall off an edge or a ledge that is virtually impossible to spot and just die, without there being any danger. It's super anticlimactic. And damn, not just that the devs were aware of it, but they even play with it by putting up traps that are virtually indistinguishable from the background, where you'll just game over into your doom without anything telegraphing it. It's just mean game design. But here's one pro tip for any jumping segment in this game. If you struggle to tell which direction your character is facing, like precisely, which will happen all the time, pull out your guns and use a laser pointer as sort of like a guidance beam pointing on the floor before you. You'll thank me later. The uniform darkness of the backgrounds also has the problem there are quite a few instances where interactable objects in the environment completely vanish into the background. There's a segment in the canals of the first chapter where I was stuck for hours until I found that I didn't see this lever here. Yeah, another pro tip. If you get stuck in a room, turn on your flashlight because using light and shadow can help you highlight virtually indistinguishable objects. Some contrast would have been a blessing here, even if the game wants to be grimdark, but you can be grimdark with a little bit of color pop. Anyway, in the same vein, it often feels to me that in 90% of the confrontations that pose a real difficulty, the actual enemy is not your adversaries, but the camera perspectives. For one, because Nocturne loves to constantly pick angles that look cool and cinematic over ones that are well suited to actually play the game comfortably with a good sense of your surroundings. Another part is that, this is a bit of technical conjecture on my side, it feels like in vast parts of the environments the game doesn't actually use trigger points or trigger areas to determine the current camera perspective, but that instead the transitions between perspectives are mostly determined by the camera itself scanning if the player is still visible. And only once the player is not detected anymore will the game scan for the next camera that detects them. This sounds like a very smart procedural solution to something that would otherwise be a ton of painstaking manual labor, but it's honestly just lazy because in execution it's just plain aggravating. Because let's say you're in a room and you can see a bit through a door into the next room, for instance, from that camera perspective. Well, the stranger can walk really deep into the next room as long as he's still picked up by the camera of the previous room, and the camera won't switch to one from the room he's already in. Or even within just a single room, you almost always have to walk the stranger right up to the very edge of the screen before the game hopefully switches to a camera perspective that allows you to see what's right in front of him. Fixed camera survival horror games often have this problem of enemies that are really close to you and that the player character is directly facing, being invisible to the players until the camera switches. And Nocturne is definitely one of the absolute worst offenders of this. The camera system has the effect that the biggest difficulty in combat encounters is often that you don't see the opponents that are attacking you, which is an especially huge pain in the ass with enemies with long-distance weapons, because they perfectly know where you are, but you don't know where they're shooting from. Which is why the entire Chicago chapter, really with virtually every enemy wielding a Tommy gun, is, in my opinion, by far the weakest part of the game. But there's yet another major issue with the way backgrounds are rendered and quite frequently primarily staged for cinematic effect over readability and playability, and that's that the game absolutely does not give a rat's ass about things like the 180-degree rule. In filmmaking, there's this pretty well-established rule of thumb that if you don't want to confuse the viewer's sense of orientation, you don't just change a camera position willy-nilly and especially avoid placing it outside of an imaginary 180-degree cone around the actors. That way, for instance, a character moving to the right means that they're always moving in the same relative direction in space. If you'd suddenly move the camera to the other side and then flip back, it completely throws the viewer's spatial sense off. Nocturne doesn't care, or probably never even thought about it during development, it feels like, which makes it even worse in a game where navigating large, maze-like, open-ended environments is a core challenge. There are some levels where this becomes almost insulting, like the back alleys of the Chicago streets, where the challenge is to use the back alleys to avoid the main streets where the mobsters are patrolling cleverly. The camera keeps switching angles wildly all the time in any direction, top down, left, right, cool bottom shot, whatever. No directional consistency whatsoever, so that it becomes virtually impossible to maintain a sense of where you actually are in relation to the streets you entered the back alleys from. This becomes a problem not just here, but in multiple segments of the game. Yet another case where unnecessary challenge arises from something that should not be a challenge in the first place. And there is no video game mechanical metaphor in this, like the protagonist you play having a bad sense of orientation, which is then represented by the mechanics or something like that. No, it's just plain badly thought out level design. Plain and simple. There's other issues like cutscenes feeling incredibly jagged and sometimes getting caught in endless loops because a character gets stuck on an obstacle, or ladders not working properly, making you either glitch fall to your death or glitch into the environment, which then forces you to use the Jank jump mechanics to free yourself, but then glitch fall to your death. I really could go on, but this is something that you should be absolutely aware of if you want to pick Nocturne up. It is a jank fest par excellence, so you need to have at least a slight bit of a jank-resistant stomach lining, plus a heaping helping of patience in order to tolerate its worst parts. Look past them to be able to enjoy it for the many great things it has to offer.
You're the one who needs help.
What the hell? Crazy bitch.
I cover a lot of old games on my channel, and constantly hear people say, this game needs a remake, about any old game mentioned. And quite often, I find it almost insulting when I think that a game absolutely does not need a remake at all. The original is there, it's great, it plays great, it still feels great, it looks great, it's polished, and you can play it on old and new systems. No remake needed here. But with Nocturne, this has never been truer. I'm firmly convinced that if someone would pick up this license today and remake this game, or remaster it and polish it and bring it up to snuff with clean and tidied up game design, it would be an absolute banger. Get on it, Night Dive. This one's made for you. But honestly, replaying it for this video, I kept feeling that this game feels like an unfinished alpha or beta version, a proof of concept that was trying to, prove that this setting and game style absolutely works and warrants the production of a fully fledged, polished sequel, one that expands upon the promising scenario established here, which Terminal Reality had absolutely planned. It was stated by the developers in many interviews, and the game even ends on a really nasty cliffhanger to boot, but then a sequel never came out, right? Well, while there never was a direct Nocturne 2, the game actually had quite the extended and fascinating lineage. For starters, Terminal Reality had in fact started to work on Nocturne 2. This game would have, at least in part, made Svetlana Lupescu your sidekick in the first scenario and recurring side character across the game, a playable character, if not even the protagonist. Problem was that during development, Terminal Reality had to sign up with a new publisher, and, respectable move, at the time, they were not willing to put the rights to their baby in the hands of a publisher they didn't fully trust yet. So, Nocturne 2 was changed into a completely new IP, and Svetlana was redesigned into none other than Rain, the protagonist of the Blood Rain series. Which means that without Nocturne, we would never have been blessed with yet another Uwe Boll masterpiece when it was adapted into one of the best movies in cinema history. But that's not all. Terminal Reality eventually did continue to make games directly set in the setting established in Nocturne, bringing the Spookhouse and many of the characters introduced in the first game back. What I did not see coming was that they actually got a deal to have these games be set in the narrative universe of Blair Witch. So yes, the Stranger and Svetlana and all the other characters we meet in Nocturne, they are all canonical in the Blair Witch universe, which also means that the plot of episode 3 of Nocturne, which involves Al Capone working with a Nazi scientist to create an army of reanimated Frankenstein mobsters to take on the world, this is something that canonically happened around 70 years before the teenagers got lost in the woods in the iconic progenitor of the found-footage horror genre.
I'm scared to open them.
I don't quite know how to feel about that, to be completely honest. Anyway, Terminal Reality ended up releasing not just one, but 3 survival horror games in the Blair Witch universe, also known as the Blair Witch Trilogy, featuring Volume 1, Rust in Par, Volume 2, The Legend of Coffin Rock, and Volume 3, The Kelly Edward Tale. In each of these games, players take on the role of a different protagonist. Like in the first one, we get to play as Doc Holliday, the scientist in the Spookhouse that the Stranger has regular instances of banter with and that provides him, on occasion, with tailor-made weaponry and ammunition for his cases at hand. The games were developed in the same engine as Nocturne and play quite similarly, and they are, just like Nocturne, everything but perfect, but they all have some moments to shine and also a lot of stuff to sneer at. Well, at least Volume 1 I can speak for, which feels like a direct successor a la More Tales from the Spookhouse, while Volumes 2 and 3 are set much further in the past. I must admit that I never got to play the latter 2 games in the trilogy, only the first one. I've been thinking of covering them for a while, and now with Nocturne having finally gotten the attention it deserved, I'll be making this up to how people feel about it. I'm gonna get back to you on this at the end of this video. For now, let's talk about the nightmare that is getting Nocturne to run on modern systems. I cover a lot of old games on my channel, many of which are console games that are nigh impossible to obtain physically these days, and are best emulated, or abandonware PC games that are also not available on any distribution platform or physical reseller. And I usually try to provide some brief guidance on how to get these games running on modern systems. Nocturne was definitely one of the toughest nuts for me to get running without too many hiccups on my Windows 11 machine. So initially I had written an over 1,000-word long segment in this video where I walked you through each painstaking step it took me to tweak this game well enough that it would run without any hassles on my current Windows 11 system, using a DG Voodoo wrapper, manually restricting single-core usage, compatibility modes, and frame rate limitations. It's been quite the ordeal, and just as finicky to get it across in a tutorial. But my videos aren't meant to be tutorials, so luckily there is a way better and simpler alternative to the heavy tinkerage I've gone through that I can't recommend highly enough. The abandonware blog The Collection Chamber, one of my absolute favorite video game preservation projects out there, who always strives to make easily installable packages of old games that run basically right out of the box. Like, not just for Nocturne, this site is an absolute treasure trove. Absolutely go browse its pretty impressive for a one-man project library and get obliterated by nostalgia. Anyway, Collection Chamber features a neatly pre-configured custom installer version of Nocturne that runs the game with DDrawCompat, a graphics API wrapper that convinces the game that it's running in a more contemporary environment, to explain it super simplified. I do have a few notes on this release though, which I've added to a lengthy, detailed blog post over on my Tumblr on how to get Nocturne running on modern systems. I highly recommend checking this out before going in. You'll find the link in the description of this video and in the card that just popped up. In this guide, I've also added my long-winded, detailed guide for those who want to tweak the game manually with DG Voodoo 2 and whatnot, basically the version I used to record this video, which I actually don't recommend. But for anyone who's interested in the technical tinkering, I went through to make it run and also added all of it to my blog post. Even if you don't use it to set up the game for yourself, I think it still gives a lot of technical insight into how the game operates under the hood and what to look out for in terms of compatibility for this piece of software that has been written for almost 25-year-old computer systems by now. Nocturne is a piece of horror gaming history that's worth being remembered. I can't guarantee that you'll love it, but it's a fascinating piece of video game history that's been far more neglected than it ever deserved. If you've never played it, or have never even heard about it before this video, then I genuinely think you should give it a spin if you think this could be up your alley. And if you do end up liking it, then there's a whole trilogy of sequels waiting for you to get sucked into the Blair Witch universe from a probably quite unexpected angle. As I've said earlier, I'm really intrigued to cover this trilogy in a video, but I want to know if people would be interested in this. I'll add a pinned comment to this video, so go ahead and give it a thumbs up if you want me to continue the Spookhouse saga in a future video, so I can get a feel for how you guys feel about it. Let me know. If this is your first video of mine, then hey, thank you for watching. I'm Ragnar, and on my channel I regularly cover old games, horror games, indie games, and combinations thereof. If you enjoyed this video, then make sure to subscribe and check out my backlog, and I'm sure you'll find plenty of video essays that'll be right up your alley. For everyone following, a little channel update / announcement I'd like to make. My channel has been crowdfunded for years over on Patreon to cover for all expenses and rent and food, as well as to pay adequately for the talent that I regularly work with to produce these videos. I've been asked multiple times in the past if I'd open up the YouTube membership option for support at some point, and after thinking about it for a while, I've decided that this is actually not a bad idea. It's never a good idea to put all your eggs in one basket, especially when it comes to corporations. And Patreon has, pretty much right after I opened up the memberships option, shown me that it was the right choice when they fucked up some dealings with certain card transactions dealers, which resulted in a spontaneous 40% drop in income out of the blue. Fun. Always feels good to have your livelihood in the hands of corporations, doesn't it? Anyway, for anyone who'd like to help us out with the channel, you can still do so over on my Patreon, but from today on, you also have the option to become a YouTube channel member. Just click the join button below the video, or, you guessed it, the card that just popped up. Depending on which tier you want to join, just like on my Patreon, you'll get access to perks like my detailed production blog, supporter-only Discord server, early access to videos, and, as you can see scrolling along here, you can have your name eternalized in the credits of my videos. Either in text form, or you'll join the ranks of the lovely names I've been shouting out at the end of my videos for years now. It's become such an almost meditative part of my video production by now after all this time. So, thank you for considering to support the channel, thanks for watching, for liking, commenting, and subscribing, for staying with me, and my heartfelt gratitude to the many wonderful people who've been supporting me with their monthly donations. You guys all rule so much. And among those who rule are, for instance, Lilin B, Thomas Bona, Nathan Gillick, Vasily Prokhorov, Morrigan K, Dr. Haley Isabella Colley, Thwagam, Laird Wakala, Casper Ram, Link Hughes, Chrissy, John Boring, Corey Marr, Felix, Uziel 1447, Carrie George, Billy Lott, Lucas Ferreira Leite, Tabby, Shannon Blue, Swiss Hackmod, Zoddy, Amber Wiggins, Dana Rosa, Nikot the Brave, Chuck Taylor, Ronan Crom, aka Daniel 242172, Maria Rios, Kenan Ward, Giselle, Vincent Kavanaugh, Disco Dwarf, Hunter Crawford and Margaret Strawn, Hippo Hobbley, Levin, Matt Gretton, Teraflops, 9ball 9606, Federico Rocha, Aurora Mepomene Crescendo, Jin Hansen, Lawrence E. Buben, David Zelenak, Thomas Patrick Hooper, Louise Lane, Alex Popov, Terry Collins, Catherine Escobar, Franz Johannes Follner, The Spiral Architect, Kyle Lee, Raisha Griggs, Isabella Stoner, Gehennas, Sam Laurel, Sable Cowell, Arcadian Knight, Storina Abramson, Refkins and Triscuits, Ash Deer, Felix D, and The Wretched. Until next time, ta-ta.